The rain in downtown Chicago softened the city's edges. Glass towers blurred into silver-gray mist, and the streets glistened with the reflection of red traffic lights and hurried umbrellas. Alexander Henry stood behind the one-way glass on the 27th floor of Henry Global Holdings, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat. From here, the city looked manageable, measured, and conquerable, just like everything else in his life. He didn't know that today would upend 20 years of certainty. The elevator chimed softly behind him. Mr. Henry, the quarterly audit team, just arrived, and his assistant Carla announced, her voice clipped and efficient. Alexander turned, barely nodding. "Let them wait. I need a moment." And that moment came suddenly, sharply, as he glanced down through the floor-to-ceiling glass wall of his office, directly into the atrium below. There, moving steadily along the edge of the marble floor, was a woman in a gray maintenance uniform, her hands gripping a mop. She paused briefly to tie back her hair, and the movement, the curve of her neck, the way her eyes focused downward with quiet precision, shook something loose in him. It couldn't be, but it was. Sandra. The name rang in his ears like an unfinished song. Sandra Belinda. He backed away from the glass, pulse quickening, as if proximity could pull her from 2 floors below into the chaos of his mind. He hadn't seen her since they were 18. Since Savannah. Since the summer of sunflowers and broken promises. He remembered it vividly the last time he saw her. She had been standing barefoot in the grass at the river's edge, waiting for a letter that never came. He had written every week for months after leaving for college in Boston, but her replies never came. And then silence. 20 years of silence. And now she was mopping the floor of his building. His hand reached instinctively toward the phone on his desk. "Carla," he said, voice low. "Who's handling janitorial services in the lobby today?" Carla hesitated. "That would be contracted through a third-party agency." "Is there a complaint?" "No," he said quickly. I need the name of the woman cleaning the atrium floor. Now." The name came back in an email 15 minutes later. Sandra Belinda. He stared at it for a long time. She hadn't changed her name. He left his office without his coat. As he rode the elevator down, he braced himself. He had closed deals worth billions without blinking, negotiated mergers that toppled giants. But nothing compared to the pounding in his chest now. When the elevator doors slid open, he found her in the far corner of the atrium, dipping the mop into a bucket of cloudy water, her motions methodical and almost graceful. He walked toward her slowly, almost reverently. "Sandra." She turned, and it was her. The same deep brown eyes, although now they carried a wisdom a distance. The soft curve of her mouth, which he used to kiss beneath magnolia trees in Georgia, now held steady, unreadable. For a moment she didn't speak. Her gaze scanned him without emotion, lingering not a second longer than necessary. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. "Sir." The word hit him like a slap. "It's me," he said. "It's Alexander." She blinked. No surprise, no warmth. Just a tired recognition. "I know." He swallowed. "I didn't know you were in Chicago." She dipped the mop again. "A lot of things you didn't know." A pause. He tried again. "You work here, I clean here. Technically, I work for the people who clean your company's floors." He nodded slowly, carefully. "Do you want to talk?" "Talk." She looked around the atrium, glass walls, marble floors, security cameras. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Now." "No," he said gently. "Maybe. After your shift. There's a cafe 2 blocks from here. Lakeview and Pine." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't read her face anymore. Time had taught her how to wear armor. Then quietly she said, find one coffee. I have 15 minutes. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and rain-damp coats. They sat by the window, steam rising from untouched cups. I thought about you, Alexander said a lot. Sandra didn't flinch. She folded her hands around her cup. You disappeared, Alex. I wrote to you every week. He said every single week for almost a year. I didn't get any of them. None. She shook her head slowly. Not one. He leaned forward. Did your mother? She let out a soft breath between a sigh and a scoff. Mama didn't think you were coming back. Said boys like you don't marry girls like me. I didn't believe her at first. Then the letters stopped. And I... She broke off, composing herself. I moved on. But you didn't forget. She looked him dead in the eye. No, I didn't. There was silence between them then, heavy and full of ghosts. You could have looked me up, she whispered. I did, he replied dozens of times. But your name never changed. Your number was never listed. I didn't want to be found, she said. But you came here to my building. She said I didn't come here for you, her voice calm but firm. I came here for the paycheck. I've worked 3 jobs in the last 2 years, and this one pays enough to cover rent. That's it. You're a footnote in this story, Alex. Nothing more. He nodded slowly. She stood. My 15 minutes are up. He rose too. Sandra, I'm not asking for anything. I just saw you again, and it shook something in me. Her eyes softened, if only for a second. Then she turned and walked out into the rain. Alexander sat silently in his office, the coffee on his desk untouched. He stared at her name in the system. He could pull her file, reroute her job assignment, or offer her something better. But that would be manipulation, and he owed her more than that. Sandra Belinda. She had been the one thing in his life that wasn't about money, ambition, or legacy. She had been home. Now she was a stranger with a mop in her hand and 20 years of buried pain behind her eyes. But that didn't mean the story had to end there. He wasn't sure what came next, but he wanted something more than power for the first time in a long time. He wanted redemption. He wanted her. The early evening air in Chicago was crisp, tinged with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt and the first hint of autumn. Sandra walked with quiet purpose along the sidewalk, her coat pulled tight around her. Her work shoes were damp from the puddles, her back sore from hours of labor, but none of that truly registered. What stayed with her, what echoed in her bones, was the look on Alexander's face when she said, I didn't get any of them. That hurt was genuine, and that scared her more than anger ever could. She reached the rusted gate of her apartment complex, a 3-story walk-up tucked between a laundromat and a check-cashing storefront, and let herself in. The stairs creaked beneath her steps, and the hallway light above flickered faintly. Inside her apartment, the warmth was modest, lived in. A second-hand couch framed photos of her late mother, a calendar marked with bills and shift schedules. This was her world. Small, real, hers. She sat at the table and opened a drawer from a battered desk in the corner. Inside, a bundle of old envelopes yellowed with age tied together with a blue ribbon. None of them was from him. Only letters she'd written but never sent. Only pages she'd poured herself into, convinced he had forgotten her. And now he stood before her, not a boy of 17, but a man whose name adorned skyscrapers, a man who had never stopped writing. Her mother had sworn she was protecting her. You can't build your future chasing some rich boy's memory, she used to say. He'll forget you the second he tastes real power. But the pain hadn't been in the forgetting. It had been erased before she could even understand what had happened. Sandra leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The past had returned, yes, but so waited everything left unsaid. Across the city, Alexander sat in the back seat of his town car, gazing out the window as traffic inched along Michigan Avenue. His mind wasn't on the board meeting he'd just left, or the investor calls stacked on tomorrow's agenda. It was still in that coffee shop, still with the woman whose silence had once broken him more than any market crash ever could. 20 years ago, he had lost her to silence. He had told himself she chose to leave, that she moved on, that the pain belonged solely to him. Now he knew better. The betrayal wasn't hers. It was orchestrated, calculated, and he suspected who had played the hand behind the curtain. Back in college, his steel-eyed and calculating father made it abundantly clear. There's no room for sentiment in the Henry legacy. And to his father, Sandra had been nothing more than a distraction in a maid's daughter's skin. He remembered the warning, "You want to lead this empire, then learn to cut the parts that don't fit." Alexander had refused, but that didn't mean the people around him hadn't acted independently. Could his father have intercepted the letters, paid her family, threatened her mother? There were too many questions, too many possibilities wrapped in the quiet tragedy of what could have been. And now she was here, still beautiful, still brilliant in the calm, dignified way she carried herself, still out of reach. He wasn't sure, but he was going to find out. The next day, Sandra's shift began early. The cleaning company had reassigned her to the 18th floor executive offices, but not the CEO suite. She welcomed the distance, the quiet, the anonymity. She moved from desk to desk, disinfecting surfaces, emptying waste bins, wiping smudged glass. Her hands worked out of muscle memory, but her thoughts drifted. He wrote every week. She imagined those letters, each sealed with hope, and dropped into the void. She wondered what they had said, whether they were angry, loving, desperate, whether he had mourned her the way she had mourned him. At 10:00 a.m., she took her break in the rear stairwell, where the windows offered a modest view of Lake Michigan. The light glimmered off the surface like it used to on the Savannah River, when they would sneak out after curfew and talk for hours about impossible futures. Her phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number. "If you still believe in truth, I'd like to share mine. Dinner. Tonight. 7 p.m. You choose the place. A.H." She stared at the screen. Then she deleted the message. 5 minutes later, she restored it from the trash. She didn't reply. At precisely 7:02 p.m., Sandra entered a quiet bistro tucked into a brick alleyway on the city's north side. She had chosen it carefully, somewhere private, modest, and far from the press or passing eyes of board members. Alexander was already seated, dressed not in a tailored suit, but in a charcoal sweater and dark jeans. Still immaculate, of course. Still the embodiment of restrained elegance. But tonight, he looked less like a titan and more like the boy she once knew. He stood when she approached. "Thank you for coming. I didn't say yes." She replied that I didn't say no, sitting across from him. A small smile touched his lips. Fair enough. They ordered. Neither touched the menus for long. Both ordered with the kind of automatic simplicity born from lives too busy for indulgence. When the waiter left, Sandra folded her hands. "So, talk." Alexander nodded, quiet for a moment, then met her gaze directly. "My father threatened your mother." The words landed between them like a dropped stone. Sandra blinked slowly, not out of shock but recognition. "She never told me. I didn't have proof until recently," he continued. "But after yesterday I made a few calls. People who worked for him. One of the household staff. They remembered the letters. Said he took them before they could be mailed. Said he paid your mother to move to keep you away from me." Sandra sat back, breathing carefully. "I suspected as much," she said. But hearing it aloud, it's still a punch to the gut. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be," she replied. "You didn't do it." "But I let it happen," he said quietly. "I didn't fight harder. I believed you stopped caring. And I hated you for that, Sandra, for a long time." She met his eyes then. "And I hated you for forgetting me." They sat in the silence that followed, each nursing the old bruises of misunderstood youth. Then softly, she added, "You weren't the only one who wrote letters." His eyes widened slightly. "I kept them all," she said. "My letters. Never sent. Hundreds. I didn't stop writing until I stopped crying. I'd give anything to read them," he whispered. "You wouldn't like what they say," she murmured. "Maybe not," he said, "but I'd want to know you through them." For a moment, the air between them shimmered, fragile, tentative. "I'm not the girl you left behind," she said finally. "Life hasn't been easy. I've fought for every inch of ground I stand on." "I know," he replied. "And I don't want her back. I want to see the woman you've become." Sandra let that linger. Dinner came. They ate slowly, conversation drifting between memory and curiosity, between old stories and present realities. He told her about his mother's quiet death, the estrangement from his father, and the battles for control of the company. She spoke of caring for her mother through illness, working 3 jobs, and building a life without a net. By the time they finished dessert, the world outside had dimmed into the deep blue of early night. Street lamps flickered to life. Inside the table felt like its own small universe full of things lost, and things perhaps still possible. As they stood to leave, Alexander hesitated. "May I walk you to your train?" he asked. She considered for a moment, then nodded. They stepped into the cold air together, not as strangers, not yet as friends, but perhaps something more fragile, an understanding, a second chance born from a truth 20 years delayed. And in that silence, neither dared to hope aloud. But hope, nonetheless, stirred. The next morning unfolded in its usual choreography. Elevators chimed. Heels clicked down polished corridors. Lattes steamed on desks. Yet beneath the clinical rhythm of Henry Global Holdings, a tremor was beginning to stir, small but persistent. It started with a glance. Just a glance. From Madeline Shore Senior Counsel and Alexander's most trusted advisor. She was leaving the 28th floor conference room when she passed the glass balcony overlooking the atrium and caught sight of Sandra again, mopping near the front sculpture. There was nothing overtly wrong about the scene, except perhaps how still Alexander stood above at the far end of the mezzanine watching. Too long. Too focused. Madeline slowed her steps. When she followed his gaze, the realization dawned. And though her expression remained unreadable, her mind turned. In his office, Alexander paced behind his desk, a folder open but unread. His thoughts were not on quarterly earnings or legal memos. They were still tangled in last night's conversation, the sharp edges of the past, the impossible weight of what had been stolen from both of them. He had walked Sandra to her train, their goodbye, lingering not in words, but glances, an unspoken promise of unfinished conversation. He hadn't wanted to let her go. Now, in the sober light of day, his instincts whispered that something would soon come between them again. But not from Sandra, from within his world. His father may be long gone, buried beneath polished stone and hollow legacy speeches, but his influence had left echoes everywhere in the empire. People were watching, and they never stayed silent for long. The intercom buzzed. Alexander Carla's voice. "Madeline's here. Send her in." Madeline entered with her usual poise, sleek gray blazer, a leather folder in one hand, her gaze as sharp as ever. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. About what? About whatever's brewing between you and the woman in the atrium. Alexander stiffened. You've been seen, she continued more than once. You're not exactly subtle and people talk. I'm not here to scold you, Alex. But if you're serious about whatever this is, you must prepare for fallout. I don't owe the board an explanation about my personal life. No, she agreed. But if it intersects with the company, you'll be expected to defend it, especially if your actions could be construed as favoritism or worse, scandal. There is no scandal, he said firmly. She's a janitor in your building. She's not just a janitor, he replied, quiet, but unmistakably cold. Madeline paused. Then what is she? Alexander looked out the window, fingers tightening on the edge of his desk. She's someone I lost a long time ago, and I won't lose her again, not because of optics. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of city traffic below. Madeline's tone softened slightly. Then make it clean, transparent. Don't let it unravel in whispers. The last thing you need is this being weaponized. Alexander nodded once. I appreciate your honesty. She turned to leave but paused at the door. Just remember, Alex's power is fragile, especially when built on old foundations. People will test you. He didn't answer. But she wasn't wrong. Sandra was finishing her shift downstairs when another cleaner, Janelle, approached her near the back hallway. Hey, Janelle hesitated. You might want to know people are talking. Sandra paused. About you and the CEO. Sandra's heart gave a sharp jolt, but her face remained composed. What do you mean? Someone saw him looking at you yesterday. Then this morning again. Said he walked out mid-meeting to stand up there for 10 minutes. Sandra said nothing. Janelle pressed on awkwardly. You should know. People, they talk, you know, and not always kindly. I appreciate the heads up. Janelle gave a sympathetic smile. He's fine as hell, girl, but fine doesn't pay for ruined reputations. When she left, Sandra stood alone, momentarily gripping her mop like a lifeline. She had wanted this to be private, quiet, a fragile rediscovery of something thought long buried. But of course the world never left beauty untouched, especially when it crossed boundaries, especially when it dared exist between someone like her and Alexander Henry. That evening, Sandra found a note slipped under her apartment door. No envelope, just folded paper, handwritten in a steady, familiar hand. I want to see you again. I'm chasing ghosts, not because I see the woman before me now, and want to know her. Will you let me? Below it, an address. Not a restaurant. Not his penthouse. A gallery. Sandra stared at the name. Marceline and Bowers. She hadn't heard it in years. She dreamed of showing her sketches there when she was still studying fine arts at community college before her mother's illness. It had been one of those foolish, impossible dreams. She ran her fingers along the note. He remembered. The gallery was soft lit, all exposed brick and brushed steel, filled with abstract light sculptures and quiet piano music. When Sandra entered, she found Alexander near the far wall, hands clasped behind his back, staring at a charcoal piece with long, sweeping strokes that almost seemed to move. I didn't think you'd come, he said without turning. I almost didn't. He looked over his shoulder and smiled. But you did. They walked the room together, saying little. Occasionally she paused before a piece and gave her thoughts, and he listened, not with performative attention, but with the kind of hunger reserved for those trying to understand art, but the artist beside them. When they reached the second floor, a small installation space tucked into a corner, she found something that stopped her. Sketches. Soft graphite. Quiet detail. Each one a window into stillness. A woman standing barefoot in river grass. A pair of young hands touching water. A boy in profile smiling through summer rain. Her breath caught. These were her drawings. Not originals, but copies. Scanned. Preserved. How? I saved them, he said softly. The ones you gave me, from the summer before college. I had them framed years ago privately. They've been in my home. I asked the gallery to host them for one night just for us. She turned to him, heart pounding. Why? Because you never stopped being an artist, Sandra. The world just made you forget. He stepped closer. I want you to remember. Her walls, those built from years of fatigue and disappointment, cracked. Just a little. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. Inside, a photo. A younger version of himself at 18, holding a sketchbook on the steps of her mother's porch. Smiling. And behind him in soft pencil, Sandra's initials. He said, I found this when cleaning my mother's attic. I thought I'd lost all of it. But this was there. A memory I didn't know she kept. Sandra held the photo gently. The edges worn, the ink faded. For the first time in days, she smiled tender aching. I don't know what this is, Alexander, she whispered. I don't believe in rekindling something that broke this cleanly. I'm not asking for a promise. He said only a beginning. Outside, the wind picked up. Rain tapped softly against the gallery windows. Inside they stood, not as CEO and janitor, not as man and woman divided by years and class, but as two souls standing at the fault line of memory, uncertain of the future, but no longer imprisoned by the past. She folded the photo and tucked it into her coat, then nodded. A beginning then. And for the first time in a long while, Sandra Belinda did not feel small beneath the city's weight. She felt seen. The next morning, sunlight poured through the eastern-facing windows of Henry Global's headquarters, staining the atrium in warm gold. But the warmth never reached the upper levels, where the actual business of power resided behind polished glass and whispered alliances. Madeline Shore stood at her office window, cradling a cup of black coffee. Below her, just beyond the railing of the mezzanine, she saw Sandra again, calm, methodical, invisible to most. Not to Alexander. Not anymore. It wasn't jealousy, not precisely, that stirred beneath Madeline's skin. It was something colder, sharper. She had spent 15 years shaping the contours of Alexander's empire. She knew how he thought, what he avoided, what cost him sleep. She knew when to press and when to step back. And she had never asked for more than her seat at the table. Until now, no one else had ever occupied his blind spot. But Sandra Belinda. A former housemaid's daughter turned janitor number Madeline took a slow sip and turned toward her desk. If the board got wind of this and turned it into a scandal, everything she had helped build could fracture her workplace and legacy. Alexander wouldn't see it until it was too late. So she'd see it for him and take action where he would hesitate. That same afternoon, Sandra entered the break room on the 15th floor to find an envelope taped to her locker. Plain. No name. Just sealed shut. She looked around. Empty. Carefully, she peeled it open. Inside was a printed email. A scanned message chain from 2 years ago between Alexander and a former executive assistant. The content was ambiguous, but suggestive. Flirtatious tones. Late-night meetings. References to undisclosed agreements. Her heart constricted. The emails could easily be read as evidence of a secret relationship, or worse. She sat down slowly on the bench, staring at the paper. Had someone planted this? And if so, why? She folded the pages and tucked them into her bag. Not because she believed them, but because something inside her warned this was just the beginning. Elsewhere, A very different conversation unfolded in a quiet corner of a high-end bar in River North. Daniel Price, a partner at Blackridge Capital, Henry Global's largest shareholder, leaned over his bourbon, voice low. "You sure about this?" he asked Madeline, who sat across from him in tailored steel gray. "I'm sure about what's at stake," she replied coolly. "He's vulnerable right now. Sentimental, distracted." Price raised a brow. "And the woman, emotional leverage," she said. "You know how these things work. Public opinion is volatile. Investors don't like uncertainty. And this thing between them, it's a crack in the glass." Daniel swirled his drink. "I could make a call. See if the press might be interested in an anonymous tip. Workplace scandal, favoritism, maybe even misuse of company resources." "No," Madeline said. "Not yet. Let it simmer. Watch how Alexander reacts. If he keeps pushing this, we will act. But if he lets her go," she leaned forward, "we won't need to get our hands dirty." He smirked. "You've always had a surgical touch." "I don't play games," she replied. "I protect what's mine." That evening, Alexander stood in the lobby of Sandra's building, hands in the pockets of his wool coat. The air smelled of rain again. He stared at the elevator panel, wondering whether he had crossed some unseen line simply by showing up. The door opened. Sandra stepped out. Their eyes met. But something in hers was different, distant, guarded. "Thank you for coming," he said. She replied, "I wasn't sure I would," pulling her coat tighter. "I needed time." "Time for what?" She paused. "To remember the difference between then and now." He tilted his head. "Sandra." "What happened?" She handed him the envelope. He scanned the pages, then looked up sharply. "Where did you get this?" "Someone left it in my locker." He exhaled, jaw clenched. "It's fabricated and taken out of context." "I figured," she said. "But it got to you." She didn't deny it. "I've been on my own for a long time, Alexander. I can't afford emotional detours. I've spent my life climbing out of the shadows that people like your board live comfortably inside. You think I see you that way? No. But others do. And I won't be collateral damage in someone else's war." He stepped closer. "This isn't just about us anymore." "No," she whispered. "It's about survival." There was pain in her eyes, not because she didn't want him, but because she did. And that made her vulnerable. And she hated it. "I'll find out who sent this," he said firmly. Sandra nodded once. "I believe you. But that won't change how they see me, or what they'll do to make me disappear again." She turned to leave. He didn't stop her. But this time he wouldn't wait in silence. Back at headquarters, Alexander summoned his head of internal security. By midnight, they had traced the origin of the email, a copy pulled from archive servers under administrative access. No breach, no external leak. Internal. He stared at the report. Only 2 employees had that level of clearance. One was the CTO, the other, Madeline Shore. He didn't want to believe it. She had stood beside him through every merger, every scandal, every hostile takeover. But her loyalty had always been to the company, to control. And this was personal. The betrayal stung, but not as profoundly as the realization that Sandra had been right. The people closest to him didn't see her as a woman. They saw her as a threat. 2 days passed. Sandra didn't return his calls. At work, she requested a reassignment to another property, but fate had its ideas. On Friday morning, a gas leak in one of the downtown buildings led to the emergency relocation of cleaning crews. Sandra, against her wishes, was reassigned temporarily, back to headquarters. She arrived at 6:30 a.m. early enough to avoid anyone important, or so she thought. When she stepped out of the service elevator onto the 27th floor, she didn't expect to find Alexander there alone, leaning against the railing, his coat unbuttoned, eyes tired. "You requested reassignment," he said. "I didn't want to cause trouble." "You're not the trouble," he said. "But I'm the one being watched." He reached into his pocket and held out a small flash drive. "This has everything," he said, "the source of the leak. The edits were made to the emails. Who accessed them?" She hesitated. "Why give it to me?" "Because I want you to know the truth, and I want you to know I'm not afraid to face what comes next with you." She looked at the flash drive, then at him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They'll come for you too. I know. And you'll lose things. Maybe. But not you." She stepped forward slowly. Their hands touched. This time it wasn't nostalgia. It was a choice. Still uncertain. Still trembling. But no longer alone. Back in her apartment that night, Sandra sat by the window as the city lights flickered in the rain. The flash drive sat beside her tea. She hadn't plugged it in. Not yet. Not because she doubted him, but part of her feared what it might cost him to fight for her this time. And still something inside her stirred. Not hope, but something more dangerous. Possibility. The city moved with its usual indifferent steel and glass, towering over fragile, fleeting lives. Inside the headquarters of Henry Global, the temperature wasn't measured in degrees but in glances. Cautious. Calculating. Cold. Alexander Henry entered the boardroom 5 minutes late. A deliberate act. His silence carried weight, and every person seated at the table from the risk assessment chair to the CFO felt it. He adjusted his cufflinks as he sat at the head of the long, glossy table. "I hear there are concerns," he said without emotion. Daniel Price cleared his throat. "We've received word of a situation. Personal in nature, possibly affecting professional dynamics." A murmur passed along the table, unspoken but understood. "Sandra." Alexander remained still. "If there is a legitimate misconduct claim, I welcome a formal inquiry." Madeline Shore leaned forward. Her tone was polished as always. "It's not about misconduct, Alexander. It's about perception. Influence. If employees believe personal relationships are affecting promotions, contracts, or building assignments, then they are welcome to submit a grievance through the appropriate channels." He interrupted, voice cool. "But no such complaint exists." Silence. He continued, "I've spent 2 decades building this company with the understanding that our standards apply equally, regardless of background, job title, or social currency. If we abandon that now, we are not protecting the firm. We are protecting an illusion." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "You're risking your position, Alex. Not everyone on this board supports you the way Madeline does." Alexander's gaze slid toward her, but Madeline didn't flinch. Of course not. She had already drawn her line. He stood and buttoned his jacket slowly. "Then allow me to remind this board, I am not merely a figurehead. I am this company's founder and majority shareholder. If moves are being made behind closed doors to discredit me or someone I care about, expect them to be exposed." He let that hang in the air. Not a threat, a promise. Then he left the glass door swinging shut behind him with a quiet finality. In a different part of the city, Sandra stepped out of the subway and walked the familiar route toward her apartment building. The day had left her hollow, drifting between resignation and unrest. She hadn't spoken to Alexander since their meeting on the mezzanine. She hadn't opened the flash drive. She was afraid that if she saw how far Madeline or anyone else was willing to go, she wouldn't be able to keep convincing herself that she didn't matter in this fight, that she wasn't worth this kind of trouble. The walk was gray. The sky is low. until a voice broke her thoughts. Sandra. She turned. A man stood across the street, hand raised in a half wave. It took her a second to recognize him. Derek. From Georgia. From before New York. Before her mother's illness. Before poverty had reshaped her dreams. Derek Johnson. The first man she ever thought she might love. Back when she still believed love could be enough. He approached with an easy grin. Same denim jacket. Same boyish charm. But older. Hardened around the edges. "I thought that was you," he said. "Didn't expect to find you in this part of town." "I live here," she replied, still catching her breath. "What are you doing in New York?" "Got a gig. Union contract with the Utilities Board. Been here a few months. Heard through the grapevine you were up here. I decided to try my luck." Sandra blinked. "You came looking for me?" He shrugged. "Been thinking about you. About us." She folded her arms, instantly guarded. "That was a long time ago." "Yeah," he said, tone softening. "But some things, they don't end, do they?" She said nothing. "Can I buy you dinner?" he asked. "Just talk. No pressure." Sandra hesitated. The timing was too precise, too uncanny, but some part of her raw, tired, and alone said yes anyway. They ended up at a small Caribbean spot near her neighborhood, with dim lights and warm spices that wrapped around you like an old memory. They ate jerk chicken and rice, and slowly the rhythm of the past filtered in between bites. "You look different," Derek said. "Not just older, like heavier, but not in a bad way." Sandra raised a brow. "Heavier, I mean the weight you carry. Like something's always on your mind now." "I clean corporate offices at night, Derek. I lost my mom. I've been fighting to stay afloat for years. Of course something's on my mind." He nodded. "I know. I didn't come here to make it worse. I came because I regretted not staying. When things got hard, I ran. And I could fix that." Her fork stilled. "You want to go back?" she said, more realization than question. "I want to give us another shot." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. "You came back into my life when someone else tried to fight for me. Do you want to tell me that's a coincidence?" His smile faded. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you don't know me anymore. You remember a version of me that didn't survive." He reached across the table, hand grazing hers. "I'm not trying to compete." "But that's precisely what you're doing," she said softly. "And I'm tired of being something men try to win, fix, or save." She stood her napkin dropping to the floor like punctuation. "I need space, Derek. That's all I can offer you." He didn't follow. He just sat there watching her go, like someone who had waited too long to speak, and finally realized silence wasn't neutral. Back in her apartment, Sandra finally opened the flash drive that night. The files were neatly organized. Time-stamped screenshots of server logs, security footage of Madeline entering the data room, even metadata from the manipulated email chain. Undeniable. But what struck her most was a typed, not scanned final note, written by Alexander. "I can't promise you the world will ever be fair, but I can promise you that I will never be quiet again. Not about you. Not about us." She closed her laptop slowly, her chest aching. He was fighting, and she had been retreating. Not out of doubt, but out of the old reflex to disappear before being erased. She ran her fingers along the window pane, watching the rain collect in tiny streams against the glass. For the first time, she didn't feel like just a reflection in someone else's story. She felt like the storm. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the office to find Madeline waiting in his private lounge. She stood when he entered, arms crossed. "You've made your position clear," she said. But so have the board members. If this continues, they'll force an executive review. They'll question your judgment, your ability to lead. Alexander said nothing. Madeline stepped closer. I told you this would happen. She doesn't belong here, Alex. His voice was quiet, but unshakable. She belongs wherever she chooses to stand. Madeline's jaw tightened. Then you're choosing her over everything we built. No, he said. I'm choosing to stop pretending that power should only belong to those born with it. Her expression faltered. He walked past her toward the conference wing. I'll be calling a press meeting next week. I'm ready to speak publicly about the leaks and my relationship with Sandra, and about the people inside this company who have confused control with loyalty. Madeline's voice came low behind him. If you do this, Alexander, you will lose allies. He paused at the door. Then they were never allies to begin with. And with that, he walked into the storm he had chosen. The morning air outside Henry Global's tower was thick with anticipation. By 9:00 a.m., journalists had already gathered near the polished glass doors. Cameras were being checked. Mics clipped. Every face bore the same expression, hungry. Sandra sat on the edge of her modest couch. The television volume turned low, but the tension loud. She wasn't used to being seen. And certainly not like this. The news banner read, Breaking Alexander Henry to address internal scandal. Personal allegations. No other names were mentioned. But her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Inside the press room, Alexander stood alone behind a minimalist podium. The background was matte black. A single emblem of Henry Global floated behind him, clean, sharp, unapologetic. He looked over the sea of journalists, reporters, and cameras without flinching. Good morning, he began. His voice was steady, unrushed. Over the past weeks, there have been rumors, insinuations, and intentional distortions concerning my personal life and my role as CEO. I am here to speak directly, not to defend, but to clarify. No one moved. He continued. Yes, I have formed a personal relationship with someone who works within our ecosystem. A woman of integrity, of dignity, of strength. There was a collective hush. She is not in a position of executive power. She has never received preferential treatment, but she has challenged me in ways few ever dared to. He took a breath. And while some may see her as a threat to the image we've built, I see her as a mirror, reflecting the very principles we claim to stand for: fairness, inclusion, humanity. Flashbulbs popped. Fingers typed rapidly. Alexander paused, letting the weight of his words land. If this company cannot accept that love and leadership can coexist without compromise, then it is the company that must change, not the truth. He stepped back. No questions were taken, no names disclosed. But Sandra's world shifted anyway. At the community center where she volunteered on weekends, whispers spread like wind. You saw the broadcast. Isn't that? Sandra kept her head down as she sorted books for the children's library. But the glances lingered. People who had known her for years now looked at her like a tabloid headline, like a story instead of a person. She excused herself early. By the time she returned home, her voicemail was full. One message from her former supervisor at the cleaning agency, tone tense, uncertain. 2 from Derek. 3 were anonymous. Cruel. Calling her names she hadn't heard since childhood. Her hands trembled as she deleted them one by one, until a knock sounded at her door. Not tentative, not urgent, just present. She opened it slowly. Alexander stood there, coat damp from the misting rain, tie undone, eyes searching. Are you okay? He asked quietly. Sandra didn't answer right away. She stepped back to let him in. He hesitated only for a moment before crossing the threshold. Inside, her apartment felt smaller than ever, too full of silence, too full of unspoken things. "Why did you do it?" she asked finally. "Because I couldn't breathe in the lie anymore." She folded her arms. "You put a target on my back. I know. They're dissecting me, speculating about who I am, what I want, what I've done. I know that too." She looked away. "You could have protected me by saying nothing. But then I would have lost you." Her breath caught. He stepped closer. "I didn't speak to save my image. I said because you matter. And because what we have doesn't deserve to be buried in shame." She shook her head, tears brimming. "I'm not ashamed of you. I'm afraid of them, of the machine that eats people like me and leaves nothing but gossip. I'll fight it," he said. "And what if I can't?" He reached out gently, touching her wrist. "Then we'll leave. Everything. Together." She stared at him. The billionaire. The empire. The man who had once seemed untouchable. Now willing to be touched only by her truth. They spent the night talking, curled on the couch, feet tucked beneath blankets, coffee cooling on the table. He told her about his childhood, a distant father, a perfectionist mother. She told him about losing her mother, how the silence in the hospital room felt like a punishment. He admitted how lonely the top could feel. She admitted how lonely everywhere else had always been. No declarations, just presence. When he fell asleep, his head against her shoulder, she didn't move. She watched the city lights blink through the window and let her guard down, one heartbeat at a time. But peace never lingered long in lives like theirs. The next morning, as Alexander exited the building through a side door, a man in a dark coat approached him with a camera phone raised. "You proud of her?" the man asked, tone slick with sarcasm. "Sleeping your way down the ladder now?" Alexander didn't answer. He kept walking. The man laughed. "Your stock's already dropping. She must be amazing in bed." In a flash, Alexander turned. The man didn't expect that. And for a moment, just a moment, rage cracked through the polished facade. He didn't hit him. He didn't shout. But his voice, when it came, was lethal. "Repeat her name," he warned, "and you'll find out what defamation costs when truth is on the other side." The man lowered the phone. Alexander left without another word. Back at Henry Global, the fallout came fast. Madeline watched the markets nosedive with forced calm. The board split, some supportive, others whispering about replacement. But Alexander moved forward. He opened a new ethics panel. He began restructuring the leadership hierarchy to reflect more diverse voices. He invited Sandra quietly to consult on the firm's community outreach efforts, an unpaid role, a symbolic one, but one he knew she was worthy of. She declined, not out of fear, but because she needed time to exist outside his orbit. She needed to remember who she was when no one was watching. And he understood. Weeks passed. The noise dimmed. Papers found new scandals. Stocks recovered. But Sandra still walked cautiously, glancing over her shoulder, at subway stations, keeping conversations short with strangers. Until one afternoon, she received a letter, handwritten, sealed in elegant parchment. It was from Alexander's mother, the woman she had never met. It read, "I once told my son that the world would never accept a woman. It didn't expect him to choose. I was wrong. The world has no say in what love deserves. And if you're the reason he's finally breathing, thank you. One day, we can meet in peace." Sandra held the letter to her chest, the paper soft against her palm. And for the first time since the storm began, she allowed herself to smile. The invitation came not through email or courier, but through something far older. Pen and ink folded carefully into an envelope bearing the Henry family crest. Alexander's mother had written to her personally. Again, Sandra stared at the note as the town car coasted along the winding road past iron gates that creaked open silently. I would be honored to meet you, not as the mother of a man the world watches, but as a woman who has raised someone who finally dares to be real. The handwriting was clean, graceful, but not impersonal. Each word carefully chosen, neither begging nor judging. Just open. As the driver pulled into the sweeping circle of the Henry estate, Sandra gripped the hem of her coat. The property sprawled like a painting white stone-green gardens, a fountain shaped like an open hand catching water. It was the kind of place that whispered legacy. She stepped out, boots crunching against gravel. Before she could knock, the door opened. And there she was, Caroline Henry. Impeccably dressed in a pale gray wool dress, her silver hair swept into a twist, pearls resting at her collarbone. But her eyes, that same steel blue Alexander carried, softened the moment they met Sandra's. "Welcome," she said. Sandra inclined her head slightly. "Thank you for inviting me. Come in. It's cold enough to snap bones today." The house was warm in a way Sandra hadn't expected. Not sterile or museum-like, but lived in. There were old books on the shelves, worn rugs, family photographs, some of which showed a much younger Alexander unsmiling standing beside his father. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Caroline admitted as she poured tea, her movements graceful but without pretense. Sandra oversaw her. "I wasn't sure either. And yet, here you are." Sandra looked around the room. "You know, I used to imagine homes like this. As a kid, I wanted to live in one, not because I wanted to know if the people inside them ever felt cold when the heat was on." Caroline tilted her head. "And what do you think now that you're here? It depends on who's keeping the fire." There was a pause, a subtle nod. "You have a poet's instinct," Caroline said. "That scares people like me. We build things in columns and contracts. You live in what can't be measured." Sandra met her gaze. "You asked to meet me." Why, Caroline set her teacup down. "Because for the first time in years, my son looks like someone who isn't suffocating." "That's not just me," Sandra replied. "That's him choosing to breathe." Maybe Caroline allowed. "But he's always been a man afraid of being seen." You look at him without flinching. That's rare. And rare things should be understood. Sandra folded her hands. "And have you come to understand me?" "I'm trying," Caroline said. "I don't pretend to know the roads you've walked. I only know that if my son is offering you his world, he's also offering you his ghosts. And I want you to know his past is heavy. I don't expect him to come weightless." "Good," Caroline said. "Then you have a chance." After tea, Caroline walked her through the gallery wing, where the Henry family's legacy was documented in paintings, awards, and oil portraits that watched you with eyes far too alive. Caroline stopped at the end of the hallway, before a large double door. "This room is locked," she said. "Always has been. Not even the staff goes in." Sandra raised a brow. "Why are we here?" Caroline hesitated. Then quietly she pulled a brass key from her pocket. "It belonged to his father," she said. "And it was the last thing Alexander asked me for when he took over the estate." The key clicked. The door opened. And inside was not a secret chamber, but a study frozen in time. A grand piano covered in dust. Photographs in cracked frames. A fireplace lined with unopened letters. "He hasn't touched any of it," Caroline whispered. "Not since the funeral." Sandra stepped inside. The air was still, like memory itself had refused to move forward. She walked to the piano, brushing dust from the keys. "You said he's afraid of being seen," she murmured. "But maybe he's just scared no one will stay once they do." Caroline said nothing. She didn't have to. Later that evening, as the car drove her back toward the city, Sandra watched the countryside blur past. Her reflection in the window looked different. Not changed, but claimed. This wasn't just about love anymore. It was about inheritance, not of wealth, but of pain, of silence, of survival. She thought about the unopened letters, about the piano that hadn't been sung on in years. And she understood with sudden clarity why Alexander had always seemed so composed, so guarded. He didn't know how to speak what had never been named. When she arrived home, he was waiting outside her apartment. No suit, no security detail. Just a man holding 2 coffees and a heart full of uncertainty. "I didn't expect you," she said softly. He handed her the warm cup. "I heard you went." "I did." "And?" She took a sip before answering. "She's not what I thought." "And your house? It's less perfect than I imagined." "That's accurate." "There's a piano," she added. He looked away. "Did she show you the music room?" I asked, no questions. "I just listened." He nodded, silent for a moment. Then with a breath, "My father used to sit there for hours. He wouldn't play, just stare at the keys like they owed him something." Sandra leaned against the doorframe. "And you?" "I tried to play once. After he died." The sound felt too loud, like it didn't belong in grief. She tilted her head. Maybe it was the only thing that did. Their eyes met. And in that quiet space between the past and the present, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition of the weight they both carried, and the truth that neither was meant to bear it alone. A week later, Alexander returned to the music room, alone. He dusted off the keys, sat, placed his hands gently on the ivory, and played. Not well, not confidently, but honestly. The melody was halting, imperfect, human, and for the first time, the room didn't echo grief. It welcomed something else, something living, something brave. The letter arrived in a white envelope, hand-delivered to her apartment by a black courier with a sleek smile. "Sandra Belinda?" he asked, formal and cautious. "Yes," she said, drawing her cardigan tighter around herself. He extended the envelope and disappeared before she could even thank him. She turned it over in her hands. No markings, no return address. Her name was just written in a clean serif font. Inside was a card embossed with gold, Jameson and Pearl, Publishing Executive Editor, Alicia Myers. And below it, in simple black ink, "We believe your story is yours to tell. We're ready to listen if you're prepared to say it. No scripts, no spin, just your voice." She sat down slowly, rereading it. And again. Then she placed it face down on the table, as if it might burn her fingers if she held it any longer. It wasn't the first offer. Since Alexander's press conference, whispers have followed her like shadows, magazines asking for interviews, podcast hosts, leaving cryptic messages on her voicemail, and even reality television scouts emailing her under fake names. She had ignored them all, but this felt different. Jameson and Pearl were respected, quiet, literary. They published memoirs and cultural essays, not tabloids. Sandra had read their books. She had once held a first edition from them in her college dorm, as if it were sacred. This wasn't a trap. It was an invitation, and that made it more dangerous. She didn't mention it to Alexander, not yet. Instead, she sat with it, for days. Carrying the card in her coat pocket like a stone, she wasn't sure she wanted to keep or throw it into a river. She asked herself what the cost of silence was, what the price of visibility might be, which was heavier, the burden of misinterpretation or the vulnerability of truth. It was Caroline, Alexander's mother, who noticed first. They were having tea in a cafe on the Upper West Side again, quiet with windows that looked out on yellowing trees and children kicking leaves with wild joy. "You're distant," Caroline said, stirring her spoon with precision. Sandra offered a half smile. "Just thinking. That's always dangerous." Sandra met her gaze. "Have you ever wanted to tell your story before someone else told it for you?" Caroline paused mid-stir, then slowly set the spoon down. "I once did," she said. "When I was your age, a journalist asked me what it was like being married to Gregory Henry. I said it was like being the glass around a chandelier, beautiful to look at, but invisible, and constantly in danger of breaking." Sandra blinked. "What happened?" "He never forgave me for it. And yet, it was the only sentence in the article they printed without edits." Sandra folded her hands. "What if people only hear what confirms what they already want to believe?" Caroline's voice softened. "Then say it anyway. For you, not for them." That night, Sandra told Alexander. They were curled up on her couch, jazz humming softly through her apartment. His shoes kicked off her legs, tucked under his. She handed him the card, watched his expression shift from curiosity to alertness. "They want your side of things," he said. "They want me," she clarified. "Not as your girlfriend. As for myself." He nodded slowly. "And what do you want?" "That's the part I haven't figured out." He turned toward her, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "If you want it," he said carefully, "then do it. If you don't, I'll protect the silence." She swallowed. "Alicia Myers doesn't do gossip. She publishes the truth. But once it's out, we can't call it back." Alexander rested his hand over hers. "You've lived in my world. If you want to invite the world into yours, now that's your right." She looked into his eyes. "I don't want to write a tell-all. I wouldn't expect you to. I want to write about grief, about race, about being seen before being heard, about love that doesn't fit the photos people expect." His thumb traced hers. "Then that story deserves to live." In the weeks that followed, she met with Alicia Myers 3 times. No recording devices, no handlers. 2 women sat across a wooden table with black coffee and complex questions. "Why now?" Alicia asked. Sandra answered, "I spent my life trying to be invisible for safety. Now, I want to be visible for the truth." "Do you want to vindicate yourself?" "No," Sandra said softly. "I want to reclaim myself." The editor nodded, writing nothing but absorbing everything. They worked together, slowly building an outline that wasn't about headlines or dates, but about emotional architecture. Pain, silence, strength, and the small, quiet ways women rebuild themselves when the world isn't watching. When the manuscript was halfway done, Alicia handed her a draft of the foreword. Sandra sat in a small cafe in Brooklyn, reading the pages. It didn't mention Alexander's name once, and yet he was everywhere in it. Not as a savior, but as a witness. A man who had stepped aside when she needed space, stepped forward when she needed protection, and stepped back again when she needed light to fall on her instead. Sandra cried while reading it, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't have to. Alexander didn't read the manuscript. She hadn't offered, and he hadn't asked. Instead, one night he kissed her temple and whispered, "Tell it how you remember it. That's the only truth that matters." A month before the publishing date, the title was finalized, Unscripted Light, a memoir of becoming visible. The cover was minimalist, a silhouette of a woman in profile, not Sandra's image but her essence, and below it a single line, for the ones who were told to wait their turn to speak. When the book went to print, Sandra retreated from public appearances. She turned down interviews, declined signings, refused a talk show invitation. She had never wanted to become a public figure, only a private truth-teller. And when the reviews came in glowing, polarizing, reverent, she didn't chase them. She walked the same neighborhood streets she always had, headphones and coat collar high, letting the world keep turning. Only now, it knew her name, and more importantly, her voice. The letter arrived in a white envelope, hand-delivered to her apartment by a black courier with a sleek smile. Sandra Belinda, he asked, formal and cautious. Yes, she said, drawing her cardigan tighter around herself. He extended the envelope and disappeared before she could even thank him. She turned it over in her hands. No markings, no return address. Her name was just written in a clean serif font. Inside was a card, embossed with gold, Jameson and Pearl Publishing Executive Editor, Alicia Myers. And below it, in simple black ink, "We believe your story is yours to tell. We're ready to listen if you're prepared to say to it. No scripts, no spin, just your voice." She sat down slowly, rereading it. And again. Then she placed it face down on the table, as if it might burn her fingers if she held it any longer. It wasn't the first offer. Since Alexander's press conference, whispers have followed her like shadows, magazines, asking for interviews, podcast hosts, leaving cryptic messages on her voicemail, and even reality television scouts emailing her under fake names. She had ignored them all. But this felt different. Jameson and Pearl were respected, quiet, literary. They published memoirs and cultural essays, not tabloids. Sandra had read their books. She had once held a first edition from them in her college dorm as if it were sacred. This wasn't a trap. It was an invitation, and that made it more dangerous. She didn't mention it to Alexander. Not yet. Instead, she sat with it. For days. Carrying the card in her coat pocket like a stone, she wasn't sure she wanted to keep or throw it into a river. She asked herself what the cost of silence was, what the price of visibility might be, which was heavier, the burden of misinterpretation or the vulnerability of truth. It was Caroline Alexander's mother who noticed first. They were having tea in a cafe on the Upper West Side again, quiet, with windows that looked out on yellowing trees and children kicking leaves with wild joy. "You're distant," Caroline said, stirring her spoon with precision. Sandra offered a half smile. "Just thinking, that's always dangerous." Sandra met her gaze. "Have you ever wanted to tell your story before someone else told it for you?" Caroline paused mid-stir, then slowly set the spoon down. "I once did," she said. "When I was your age, a journalist asked me what it was like being married to Gregory Henry. I said it was like being the glass around a chandelier, beautiful to look at, but invisible and constantly in danger of breaking." Sandra blinked. What happened? He never forgave me for it. And yet, it was the only sentence in the article they printed without edits. Sandra folded her hands. What if people only hear what confirms what they already want to believe? Caroline's voice softened. Then say it anyway. For you, not for them. That night, Sandra told Alexander. They were curled up on her couch, jazz humming softly through her apartment. His shoes kicked off her legs, tucked under his. She handed him the card. Watched his expression shift from curiosity to alertness. "They want your side of things," he said. "They want me," she clarified. "Not as your girlfriend. As for myself." He nodded slowly. "And what do you want?" "That's the part I haven't figured out." He turned toward her, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "If you want it," he said carefully, "then do it. If you don't, I'll protect the silence." She swallowed. Alicia Myers doesn't do gossip. She publishes the truth. But once it's out, we can't call it back. Alexander rested his hand over hers. You've lived in my world. If you want to invite the world into yours now, that's your right. She looked into his eyes. I don't want to write a tell-all. I wouldn't expect you to. I want to write about grief, about race, about being seen before being heard, about love that doesn't fit the photos people expect. His thumb traced hers. Then that story deserves to live. In the weeks that followed, she met with Alicia Myers 3 times. No recording devices, no handlers. 2 women sat across a wooden table with black coffee and complex questions. Why now? Alicia asked. Sandra answered. I spent my life trying to be invisible for safety. Now I want to be visible for the truth. Do you want to vindicate yourself? No, Sandra said softly. I want to reclaim myself. The editor nodded, writing nothing but absorbing everything. They worked together, slowly building an outline that wasn't about headlines or dates, but about emotional architecture. Pain, silence, strength, and the small, quiet ways women rebuild themselves when the world isn't watching. When the manuscript was halfway done, Alicia handed her a draft of the foreword. Sandra sat in a small cafe in Brooklyn reading the pages. It didn't mention Alexander's name once, and yet he was everywhere in it, not as a savior, but as a witness. A man who had stepped aside when she needed space, stepped forward when she needed protection, and stepped back again when she needed light to fall on her instead. Sandra cried while reading it, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't have to. Alexander didn't read the manuscript. She hadn't offered, and he hadn't asked. Instead, one night he kissed her temple and whispered, "Tell it how you remember it. That's the only truth that matters." A month before the publishing date, the title was finalized, Unscripted Light, a memoir of becoming visible. The cover was minimalist, a silhouette of a woman in profile. Not Sandra's image, but her essence. And below it, a single line, for the ones who were told to wait their turn to speak. When the book went to print, Sandra retreated from public appearances. She turned down interviews, declined signings, refused a talk show invitation. She had never wanted to become a public figure, only a private truth teller. And when the reviews came in glowing, polarizing, reverent, she didn't chase them. She walked the same neighborhood streets. She always had headphones and coat collar high, letting the world keep turning. Only now it knew her name. And more importantly, her voice. Alexander hadn't been to the boardroom in 2 weeks. He'd attended meetings, sure, digitally, politely, but not in person. Not until today. The tension was unmistakable the moment he stepped through the glass doors of the Henry Global headquarters. Polished silence greeted him. Too polished. Like something had been wiped too clean too quickly. His assistant offered a wary nod. "They're already inside," she whispered. He didn't respond, just walked. His rhythmic and composed steps echoed on the marble, though his heart beat with a percussion of memory and forewarning. Inside, the room was filled with familiar faces, people who had built their empires beside his, and yet today sat like a jury rather than collaborators. At the head of the table sat Dorian Strathmore, interim board chair, sharp-eyed and silk-tongued. He rose as Alexander entered. Alexander, Dorian said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome back." Alexander took his seat. "Let's not pretend this is a welcome." Dorian chuckled. "Fair enough. Let's get to it. No introductions, no pleasantries, just blood beneath velvet." The first topic was numbers, revenue, growth, market shifts, all steady, no cause for alarm. The second topic was the memoir. Unscripted Light had debuted at number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list. It was already being taught in college classrooms and book clubs. Think pieces flooded the internet. The title trended every few days. But the name on the cover, which meant publicly or not, it was tied to him. To them. Dorian tapped his pen. She doesn't name you. But the implication is heavy. Alexander's voice was quiet. Because I exist. Because you are a public man. She's no longer a private woman. A younger board member chimed in. We've received calls from major stakeholders. They're concerned about the politicization of the Henry name. Concerned about a woman telling the truth, Alexander asked calmly. Concerned about what it does to your brand. That word again. It was as if the man in the suit was a logo, not flesh and blood and change. Alexander folded his hands. What are you suggesting? Dorian leaned back smooth and clinical. A statement. A distancing. We frame this as a personal matter separate from the company. You reaffirm your focus here. Make it clear that the Henry legacy is untouched by love. Alexander interrupted. Unstained by humanity. Preserved. Dorian corrected. Alexander stood slowly. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. If your idea of legacy is silence in the face of truth, it isn't worth preserving. The room fell still. And then Dorian, without blinking, delivered the blow. If you won't sign the statement, we will call for a vote of confidence regarding your leadership. Alexander froze. A line had been drawn. Not in ink. In bone. That night, the sky over Manhattan was iron gray, threatening snow, though nothing fell. Sandra opened the door to find Alexander on her doorstep, drenched in exhaustion. He said nothing at first, just looked at her like she was the only thing not crumbling. Come in, she said softly. He didn't sit. He paced. Eventually, he spoke. They want me to cut ties with you. She didn't flinch because of the book, because of what the book represents. Silence stretched between them like a storm cloud. And then she said, What will you do? I haven't decided. His honesty was a wound, but it was also respect. She nodded once. Whatever choice you make, she said, don't make it for me. Make it for you. He turned to her, eyes burning. I want both. You and the work I've built. And you might lose one to keep the other. The words hung there. He took a step closer. If I ask you to step back, just until the vote. She stopped him with a look. I won't play invisible again, Alexander. Not even for you. His jaw clenched. He nodded once, then turned and left, not out of anger, but because he couldn't ask her to dim herself and couldn't yet find the strength to burn with her. 2 days passed. No messages, no calls, just headlines. Henry Corporation faces internal turmoil as public memoir. Stirs debate. Boardroom versus bedroom. Can Alexander Henry lead without bias? The cost of truth. When love disrupts legacy. Sandra avoided reading them. Instead, she focused on her book events. Whenever she stood before an audience, someone asked how he felt about this chapter, about that story. And always she answered, This isn't his story. It's mine. But in the quiet of her dressing room, she missed him. Not as a symbol. Not as a man who kissed her wrist before bed, or filled her fridge with overpriced oranges because he knew she liked them. She missed Alexander, the flawed boy, in the billion-dollar suit who played broken piano notes and looked at her like she was the only true thing he'd ever known. The vote came. A room full of men and women in tailored silence. Alexander stood before them and said, I will not issue a statement. I will not apologize for a woman's voice. I will not separate myself from integrity, even if it comes dressed in memoir. And when the final count was read, the board split evenly, which meant the chairman would cast the tie-breaking vote. Dorian. He rose with the smooth grace of a man long trained in manipulation. The legacy of Henry Global is strong. Consistency. Control, he said. Alexander has chosen disruption, emotion, unpredictability. Then he smiled. But that's the strength we need now. He voted in favor of Alexander. The room exhaled. Alexander didn't smile. He nodded and walked out without another word. That night, he stood in front of Sandra's door again. No grand gestures, no flowers, just a man who had finally chosen. She opened the door. He looked at her, voice low. They gave me the crown back. She nodded. At what cost? At the cost of being honest. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled a copy of her book. Dog-eared, underlined. I read it, he said. Her breath caught. And I saw you, he whispered. I never asked about all the pieces because I was too busy protecting myself. She stepped closer. And now, he placed the book on her table. Now, I want to earn the right to be in the next chapter. She didn't kiss him. Not yet. But she let him in and closed the door behind them. Not to shut the world out, but to build something the world couldn't take apart again. The invitation arrived, sealed with deep crimson wax, and the initials, HGF, Henry Global Foundation, were pressed into the seal. The annual Winter Benefit Gala. Not just a fundraiser, but a statement. A gathering of the elite. Politicians, celebrities, investors. The world's most calculating eyes dressed in their finest silk and suspicion. Sandra stared at the card on her kitchen counter for a long time. It's tradition, Alexander said behind her every year. She turned to him, lifting a brow. You want me to go with you? He walked to her, adjusted the collar of her robe, voice low. I want us to go as us. No shadows. No half-truths. Her gaze dropped to the wax seal. They'll talk. They already do. Her laugh was soft, sad. Then let them see what they're talking about. It took her weeks to decide what to wear. Not because she wanted to impress them, but because she wanted to feel whole. Not polished, not compliant. Just her. Sandra chose a gown in deep obsidian velvet. Off-shoulder. Clean lines. Strong silhouette. The color swallowed the light, but her presence lit the room. When Alexander saw her in the lobby of the St. Regis, he forgot to breathe. You look like war and poetry, he said. She took his arm. Let's give them something to remember. The gala was held at the historic Rosemont Pavilion in Tribeca. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like galaxies overhead, and the marble floor was a reflection pool of status. When Alexander entered with Sandra on his arm, conversation didn't pause. It stopped entirely. Some people smiled forced and tight. Others looked away. A few whispered, thinking she couldn't hear. But Sandra kept her posture straight, her head higher than the crown they thought she shouldn't wear. Alexander kept his hand at the small of her back, steady, present. They were no longer hiding. And the world was no longer in control. Everything was going smoothly. Until he walked in. Sandra felt him before she saw him, like a crack in the air, subtle but definite. Marcus Belinda, her ex-husband. Not invited, but connected enough to get past velvet ropes if he whispered into the right ears. He hadn't changed much. Still dressed like wealth was a performance. Still walking like entitlement was his bloodline. When their eyes met across the ballroom, Sandra froze. He smirked and began to walk toward her. Alexander noticed immediately, sensing the shift in her body. Who is that? He asked. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. Marcus reached them in seconds. "Fancy seeing you here, Sandy?" The nickname made her spine stiffen. "Marcus," she said coolly, "I wasn't aware you were involved in charitable efforts." He chuckled. "Oh, I'm not. Just curious about the guest list." Then he turned to Alexander. "Mr. Henry, I've heard a lot about you." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he extended a hand anyway. "Wish I could say the same." Marcus ignored the jab. "Quite the storybook rise, Sandra. Bestseller, new man, new life. The only thing missing is a happy ending." Sandra looked at him, voice sharp and clear. "The ending already happened. You were it." Alexander stepped slightly forward, not menacing, but protective. "We're done here." Marcus tilted his head. "You sure about that?" He pulled a small folded paper from his inner coat pocket. "The divorce wasn't as clean as you thought. I still have legal rights to some of the material in that memoir. You mentioned me more than you realized." Sandra's heart dropped. It couldn't be true. She had scrubbed the manuscript and checked it with legal. This was a bluff, but still, it landed like a stone. "I'll have my lawyer look at it," she said. "Oh, I'm sure you will," Marcus said smugly. Then he smiled. "It's funny, though. I never wanted fame, but now that you have it, maybe I deserve a piece." Alexander didn't hesitate. "I'll pay you to leave." Sandra looked at him startled. "No." But Alexander's voice was steady. "He doesn't get to infect this." Marcus grinned. "Is that how you solve everything, Henry? Buy it off?" "No," Alexander said, eyes cold. "Only things that are already for sale." Marcus laughed, then shrugged. "Suit yourself." He walked away, leaving behind the stench of arrogance and smoke. Sandra stared after him, shaken. Not because she feared him, but because for a moment she feared who she had once been with him. They left early. The car ride was silent for several minutes. Then Sandra turned to Alexander. "Don't ever do that again." He looked at her. "Do what try to protect me by writing a check." His jaw twitched. "I wasn't trying to fix you. I was trying to remove a parasite. You don't have to rescue me." He nodded. "I know." And then with more vulnerability than anger. "But watching someone threaten you like that, knowing what he did, how he left you, I'd burn the world to the ground to keep you untouched." Her eyes softened. "I don't want untouched," she said. "I want to understand." Alexander took her hand. "I'm learning." The legal threat never materialized. It was a bluff, a power play. But it reminded Sandra of something vital. Visibility is never without consequence, even when you're telling the truth, especially then. 2 months later, she published a follow-up essay in The Atlantic titled, "Not Every Ending is a Rescue," on love, autonomy, and being seen. It trended within hours. The final paragraph read, "He didn't save me. He saw me. And when someone chooses you not for the image, not for the optics, but for your whole self, you don't owe them your silence. You owe them your honesty. And maybe if you're lucky, your heart." Sandra and Alexander stayed out of the spotlight after that. Not because they were hiding, but because what they'd built was sacred. And sacred things don't always need an audience. They moved into a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, where the windows were tall and the mornings were slow. Some nights, Alexander still played the piano. Not for anyone else, just for her. And some mornings, Sandra wrote quietly, sipping coffee, with ink on her fingers and peace in her bones. They were two people who had walked through fire, not unscathed, but unashamed. Two people had chosen each other not once, but over and over, when it would have been easier not to. And in a world obsessed with spectacle, they found salvation in sincerity. If you followed the journey of Alexander and Sandra to this moment, if their love, their struggle, and their truth have stirred something in you, Please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow our channel for more unforgettable love stories that rise above the noise. Your support allows us to continue creating narratives reflecting the complexity, courage, and beauty of real connections, of